It was always fascinating how fast the bugs found a dead body. The Vikings stood over the two dead men watching as flies and carrion beetles got their fill. He felt no remorse for these men. He only felt regret because someone killed them before he did. When he came into their camp last night to bring judgment, he was astonished to find it had already been done. There was no time to investigate since the third man was missing, and the Viking didn't know who had done this or if they were still around. So he retreated to a safe vantage point and waited for the morning. Seeing them in the light of day revealed the weasel-faced man had been pierced by a blade to his throat. The large-bellied man looked like he had taken an axe to the skull. Whoever dispatched him was an effective killer. The question was, who was he? He turned to look where the third man had been sitting. Could he have turned on this man and killed him? His pack and gear lay on the ground. A half-drank bottle of Jack Daniels lay there as well. If he did kill them, he sure left in a hurry. The Viking knelt and looked at the impression of the man's boots in the dirt. He looked for the tracks leaving the camp. He found a large set of boot prints in the dirt behind where the man was sitting. He could also see drag marks. The Viking said, "So there was someone else." He stroked his beard. Why kill these two and take this one alive? He realized there was no sign to tell him the thoughts and intentions of the mystery killer. He would have to find this person and ask him himself. The third man with the raven tattoo did not deserve to escape the fate of his companions. The Viking had made a vow to the slain travelers he would keep it. Whether the mystery killer was friend or foe didn't matter. It would play out as it should. He hefted his pack from where he had set it down and headed into the woods in the direction of the drag marks. He walked for about 2 miles, moving carefully, looking for sign. There wasn't much to see, and he was about to turn around and backtrack when he came into an open area in the woods where there were tracks of some kind of vehicle. There was no way to be sure if this was the vehicle of the mystery killer, but there was no other sign, and it was near enough to the camp, and this was the direction the drag marks led. The Viking nodded and headed in the direction of the tracks. They went about 100 yards into the woods before they came into a rough trail. He looked up and down the trail and listened. Trails were convenient, but they could be dangerous. Bushwhackers could be hidden waiting to ambush unsuspecting travelers. The trail was not well worn, it was actually quite overgrown, and there were no tracks on it except for the ATV driven by the mystery killer. Well, if there were any bushwhackers on this trail, they would have encountered him first. To be safe, though, he unslung the Mini 14 from his shoulder. He press-checked it to make sure a round was in the chamber, and walked with it at the low ready. The trail moved along the contours of the forest, rising and curving with the land. The Viking noticed the farther he went along the trail, the denser the forest became. Trees towered over him. By midday, he was deep in old-growth wild woods. He looked around and breathed in the cool air. It was fantastic to be in the wild again. After being in the city, constantly fighting off cannibals, this was paradise. He stopped short. He could smell smoke. And where there was smoke, there was fire. Where there was fire, there were people. Viking snapped out of his daydreaming. He looked around for any sign that someone was near. All he saw was lush early spring forest. He sniffed the air. The smell of smoke hung faintly. He looked up for the sign of the smoke in the air, but the thick canopy of the towering trees made it near impossible to see the sky. The land rose on one side of the trail and crested to a hill. The Viking left the trail and moved up the hill. He was careful to move with purpose and not give himself away just in case there was someone nearby. The smell of smoke grew stronger the higher he moved up the hill, so he was going in the right direction. As he got close to the top of the hill, he took off his pack and retrieved a pair of binoculars. Then he crawled on his belly to the summit of the hill. The sun was to his back, and he didn't want to silhouette himself. He scanned the area below and spotted the thin wisp of gray smoke rising through the trees. He followed it down, saw a small clearing where a small campfire burned. Saw no other sign of people. He scanned the area slowly. There was nothing. Crawled back to his pack. He was putting his binoculars back when something caught his eye back down the hill. Looking through the binos, he could see a ferret-faced man walking down the trail following his footprints. He was a jittery, nervous-looking fellow. Kept looking behind him and all around. He looked up the hill, and the Viking lowered himself into the tall wiregrass. The man scratched his head and looked around confused. Then he started up the hill. The Viking grabbed his pack and crawled backward to the top of the hill and then down the other side. Once he was far enough down, he stood and made his way to the clearing. He was careful not to leave any prints. He took a quick measure of the spot and determined the best place to set up an ambush. He chose a particularly large sparkleberry bush about 15 feet across the clearing. It stood in the deep shade of the two towering oak trees. He would have great concealment. Positioned himself and readied his rifle. A minute later, he heard Ferret Face stomping down the hill and into the clearing. He looked around and went straight to the fire. He plopped down on the ground in front of it, reaching in his pocket, pulling out a glass pipe. The bowl was stained black. The Viking said to himself, "A meth head." He watched as the man produced a lighter, put the pipe to his mouth, and held the flame under the bowl. The flame was huge, and he moved it back and forth underneath, inhaling deeply the whole time. He stopped and threw the pipe and lighter to the ground. He yelled, "Damn it!" The man jumped up and paced around the clearing, scratching his arms. "I gotta get some crank, man. What happened to that guy? Bet he has good stuff." He continued to pace and mutter to himself. He stopped and stared into nothing, picking at his face. He said, "Maybe Spider or Raven will give me an advance. Just a taste. Just enough to get me right. I'm good for it." He whipped around, excited now. "Yeah, I'll tell them I have a line on 2 kids ripe for the plucking. I just need to get straight before I snatch them." The Viking's blood boiled. He had heard all he needed to hear. He burst from the shadow of the bush with his rifle leveled and ready to fire. He said, "Don't move a muscle. If I see so much as your balls shift position, I'll aerate your skull." Ferret Face yelped and jumped back. His eyes bulged. He said, "Whoa, whoa, whoa. Okay, man, you got it. Take it easy. You got me, boss." He raised his hands. He kept twitching like something was crawling over his skin. The Viking said, "What was that you said about snatching kids?" Ferret Face smiled. His face was a gruesome tapestry of his addiction. He lowered his hands. He said, got a taste for the young ones, huh? Man, I got a line on 2 sweet little cherries. We can work out a deal." And the Viking butt stroked him in the head. The man crumpled to the ground. He retrieved some paracord from his pack and walked over to the unconscious man, flipped him over on his belly, and tied his hands tightly together behind his back. Then he tied slip knots around his wrists and looped it into his back belt loops. That way, if he struggled against his restraints, he would pull the knots tighter. He dragged him to a tree and sat him up against it. Then he gathered some dry wood from the surrounding woods and tended to the dying fire. He reached into his pack and pulled out a camp percolator. He opened the lid, pulled a container of coffee out of it. He filled the pot with water from his camelback and put in the coffee. He used a stick to rake some coals to the edge of the fire and set the percolator in the center. Sat across from the man with his rifle pointed at him while he waited for his coffee. He studied the unconscious man across from him. This fallen world quickly produced 2 types of people. As the weak died out or were killed, those who remained would give in to one of 2 parts of their nature. They would become the very best or the very worst of society. Like this scum here, snatching kids to sell to depraved perverts. He would get his trial by axe. The Viking would get information from him first. It seemed there was no end to the amount of low-life scum in the forest. Couldn't be coincidence. There had to be something larger at play here. His coffee started percolating. He removed it from the heat, poured some into a metal cup from his pack. He sipped the hot cup of goodness and listened to the sound of the woods around him. These woods were wild and ancient. The Viking sensed it all around him. He could feel it in his bones, and he belonged here. The ferret-faced man started to wake up. The Viking finished his coffee in a gulp, then stored the cup in his pack and stood up. He watched as the man slowly regained consciousness. He groaned. Oh, what the hell? He shook his head gently and slowly lifted it. There was a large bloody lump on the side of his head where the butt of the gun had struck him. His eyes found the Viking standing with the rifle aimed at him. He stared dumbfounded for a moment, then his countenance changed to disgust. He said, "You slippery bastard, I'll kill you." He struggled against his restraints to no avail. He tried to stand, but managed to slip and fall on his side. "Let me out of this!" The Viking stood silently watching him. The ferret-faced man said, "You're gonna bleed, motherfucker. I'm gonna rip your eyes out and shove them up your ass." The Viking walked over and placed his boot on the man's neck, pressing him into the dirt. He let out a string of curses, and the Viking pressed harder, choking him off. He said, "Now, I'm going to ask you some questions, and you're going to give me straight answers." He pressed harder and then moved his foot. "Got it?" Ferret-face gasped and spit. He looked up at the Viking with murder in his eyes. The Viking pointed the rifle in his face. He said, "Think carefully about what you say next. If you are no use to me..." The Viking shrugged. "Then you are of no use to me. You know what I mean?" The ferret-faced man smiled and nodded. He said, "Hey man, look, I'm just a little under the weather here. I need my meds is all. Just ask your questions. I'll tell you whatever you want, and you can let me go." The Viking nodded, pulled the man upright. "First, tell me why you're here. Then tell me what is going on in this forest." The ferret-faced man grinned. "That's easy. I already told you. I round up choice tail for sale to the highest bidder." He laughed. The Viking's eyes flashed. He picked up the man by the front of his shirt. He was about to headbutt the man, but before he could, the man's head exploded brain matter. The report of a rifle echoed a second later. The Viking dropped the body and fell to the ground. He took cover behind the tree. He was sure of the general direction of the shot based on which side of the man's head blew out. He kept himself on the opposite side of the tree from that direction. This forest was proving to be not so peaceful as he thought. It seemed like everyone was trying to kill everyone else. In this case, he hoped the old saying, "the enemy of my enemy is my friend," held true. Could this be the same mystery killer who took out the two bikers and kidnapped the third? It didn't matter. He couldn't stay here. He was at the mercy of whoever was out there. His rifle lay on the ground a few feet from the tree. He slowly moved his hand along the ground towards it. A shot rang out, missing his hand by inches. So much for the enemy of my enemy crap. Looked like it was just everyone is my enemy. Another shot skimmed the side of the tree right above his head. Then another on the other side. Whoever it was letting him know they had him at their mercy. He called out, "Okay, you have me. I want no trouble. I'm going to step out with my hands raised. Do not shoot." He did as he said and stepped out from behind the tree with his hands in the air. There was no sound. For a moment, he expected to take a round to the head. But there was movement to his right, and a small form stepped from the woods. It held a scoped M14 and was covered in a ghillie suit. They said, "Don't move, or you'll look like him." The Viking was taken aback. The voice was that of a young girl.